God, Danny, if you yell like that again.
So here it is, it's 2018, and once again, there is a new Superman movie out, another adaptation of The Death of Superman. And this would be the third film adaptation, I guess, in the last 11 years. I'll go over the other two adaptations real quickly, but I'm mainly going to focus on this recent release. The first one, of course, was the 2007 animated film, Superman Doomsday. I haven't seen this one in a while. From what I remember, it was pretty good. It was pretty entertaining, but as a 90-minute film, it condensed the entire arc of the death of Superman and the reign of the Superman into one film. It's very condensed. I remember they took a lot of plot segments out. I don't even think it has the 4 clone Supermen. So for what it was worth, at the time being the only adaptation of the death of Superman, not bad. Of course, the second time that they tried to adapt the story to the screen was in Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. I'd rather not talk about that film. I did not enjoy it. But basically, the last, I guess, half an hour of the film, they slapped the Death of Superman story in there. They totally squandered it away on that mess of a movie. Doomsday, one of my favorite comic book villains, didn't really look like Doomsday. I just don't want to talk about it anymore. So now we have this recent incarnation, the 2018 version of The Death of Superman, which thankfully they're splitting into 2 parts, which I think was a wise decision. So this first film focuses on his death right up to his funeral. And of course, there's a cliffhanger that leads into next year's film, Reign of the Supermen, which is the story of these 4 clone Supermen that come back, take over Metropolis for a while until the real Superman comes back. Hopefully I didn't spoil it for you. From what research I did online, from what I could gather, there's a lot of fans that don't consider this a really great storyline. I guess they feel like maybe it's a bit overhyped. But for me, of all the comic book stories out there, this one feels the most personal because this was like my gateway into the world of comic books. This one story is what got me reading comics. And I don't pretend to be an expert. I mean, I really don't read a ton of comics. I wouldn't consider myself like an aficionado or a big comic book fan. And the comics I tend to read typically are more of the independent comics or underground comics. Back in the 90s, there was a lot of the superhero cartoons on TV. So there was like Ninja Turtles and X-Men and Batman the Animated Series. And I guess just, TV shows were more captivating because they were actual, moving images. So I didn't read comics for the longest time. Of course, I knew who Superman and Batman were because they were everywhere. They were breakfast cereals and, of course, the cartoons and things. But I don't remember reading a lot of comics. And then in the summer of 1992, there was an article in some magazine I was reading that talked about this recent comic book that was apparently making headlines called The Death of Superman. And I remember thinking I was 9 years old and I thought, no, this is just a hoax. But my uncle had the actual issue of The Death of Superman. And I remember it so vividly because it came in this black collectible bag. It had the bloody Superman emblem on it. And I remember reading it, turning the pages and just being really, the story just kept getting intensified. And finally that very last epic page where it's Lois Lane holding Superman's bloody corpse. And that's how it ended. It didn't end on a cliffhanger or anything like that. It was devastating that they would do that to this character. But it was also this great lesson in marketing because the very next year they brought him back with this whole Reign of the Superman tale, which I've read it recently for my first time. It's kind of convoluted, not the best written storyline. I kind of wish they would have left him dead for a couple of years. But at that point, from what I've gathered, a lot of people weren't really buying up Superman comics. Superman was losing money, and the creators were trying to find ways to bring in a new audience to buy Superman comics. So what better way than to kill him off for a short time anyway. And what I really enjoyed about that comic was even today, a lot of superheroes tend to have superpowers and are really immortal. You can't really hurt them. With Superman, he's bulletproof. He can fly. The only thing that really ever seemed to hurt him was kryptonite, and that never really seemed to be a permanent solution. So this was a story that finally showed that Superman was mortal, that he actually had something, more threatening than Lex Luthor finally. and that it was gonna, he had to die to basically save Metropolis. So I really always enjoyed that storyline, and I always was wishing that if they were gonna bring back Superman to the big screen, that this was the story that I would have really liked to see. And unfortunately, the one they did bring to the big screen was Superman Batman, which again, I didn't really enjoy that movie. It had a lot of problems. So again, the Superman Doomsday movie was really condensed. It was a decent attempt, but I always wanted them to focus more on this storyline. And yeah, I guess it is like a big glorifying wrestling match, but I just wanted to see that unravel. And so here we have this 2018 version of The Death of Superman, the first of apparently 2 parts. So the first thing I'll get out of the way is I do like this one better than all the other adaptations. It follows the story very closely. It's not perfect, though. Again, I really wish that they would bring this to the big screen. There's a lot of these direct-to-video animated movies that Marvel and DC are doing, and they're obvious cash grabs. They're ways to expand on the cinematic universe, but also bring in money in between these giant theatrical films. I get that. But because the budget is so limited, the animation is kind of limited. And when I saw the trailer for this movie, as excited as I was to see it, it wasn't that great. And the animation in this too is at times kind of jerky. There are some CGI elements that they incorporate into these otherwise like traditionally drawn scenes. When I was younger, like 10 years ago, I appreciated when they did stuff like that, but CGI to me never really looks good on the cheap. So there were certain aspects of that I didn't like. Certain exterior shots, Metropolis, looked great. And the fight between Doomsday and Superman is really epic. When they first clash fists for the first time, glass shatters everywhere. I mean, you really feel the epicness of this fight and what's at stake, and just, how devastating these two fighting can be. I also liked in this version, in the original storyline, the Justice League, the characters that were in the original book, I didn't know a lot of those characters. But the characters that they use now are based off of like what we've been seeing in the recent DC cinematic universe. So you've got Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash. I know not a lot about these characters, but I'm more aware of them than, say, what we got in the original story. So I like that aspect of it. Now, one of the irritating story aspects of Superman is, like, with Lois Lane, I never know in which version I'm reading, does she know who Superman really is or not? But in this one, it's very clear from the beginning that Superman still hasn't told Lois that he's really Clark Kent, or vice versa, and he's struggling with how to tell her. And that is kind of the emotional resonance of this film, is that when he finally does reveal who he is, there's a lot at stake, and it keeps coming up. There's a really emotional scene where they can't really tell each other how they feel, but he leaves her this little note expressing how he really feels about her, and kind of leaves his, what he actually feels unsaid while he goes off to fight Doomsday, which I thought was really emotional. And surprisingly, it worked. This film pulls at some heartstrings unexpectedly. So that was good. As far as Doomsday goes, well, it's Doomsday. It looks just like him. I really liked, they have him in the green uniform, that the constrictive uniform, like they did in the actual source material. And then as Superman comes in and starts fighting him and he starts getting beaten up more, it reveals more of him until the very end, where he gets so beaten up you see his whole body. And it's awesome. I mean, Doomsday, I just love the design of that character. Not the Superman, Batman live action one. But that's one of those aspects, I really wish that this was like a 2-hour film instead of 90 minutes. Because imagine seeing this in live action. We know what Doomsday looks like because, the story's been out there for 20 years now. But to see him, the first 2/3 of the movie, we slowly get to reveal what he looks like. And then the last act, it's kind of like Jason in some of the Friday the 13th movies. When he gets all beaten up, we see more what he looks like. And that would have been a really cool aspect. The other thing that they kind of skimp out on was in between The Death of Superman and The Reign of the Superman, there was this miniseries called World Without a Superman, and it basically just talked about how the characters were living in a world without Superman actually being there, and the repercussions. And I don't think we need a whole movie on that, because it's more of like a reflection piece, but certain elements of that would have been nice to pull out and put in this film as kind of like a glorified epilogue, because I thought the funeral scene as uplifting as it was and as heartfelt as it was a little short. And they skimped out on that a little bit. So those two things, I think, could have really made for a more well-rounded experience. Overall, if you're really into these animated movies and you like the Death of Superman storyline and you want to see it done again, I really enjoyed it. Again, the trailer didn't really do much for me, so I wasn't really looking forward to seeing it at first. But as a big fan of this series, I normally don't read a lot of comic books. I can count on one hand how many Superman and Batman comic books I've read, but this is really important, to me. So I really thought it was done justice, and if you liked it, I would check it out. It's worth at least a rental. So yeah, it was pretty good.